Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
It is time to change our image of Africa. For too long now, critics say aid organizations, foreign diplomats, politicians, and journalists are stuck looking at this vast continent as a convenient photo opportunity to illustrate victimhood and desperation. And few men are more forceful in advocating a change in how we perceive Africa than Binyavanga Wainaina.
If you look at the website in Kenya of any Western embassy, they talk about partnerships for development, and then you see a lot of school children suffering and then being helped by the ambassador. But they don't list the companies that are operating here. So it's the question of what's the full picture.
It is leaving lots of stories underreported, misreported, or reported again and again. Today on Talk to Al Jazeera, we sit down with one of Africa's most influential young authors to explore why the world is still not understanding Africa and how to break the lens of media distortion. Binyavanga Wainaina, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
All right. I'd like to begin with how to write about Africa or not to write about Africa, depending on the way you want to see it. It's a scathing, satirical essay which won you worldwide acclaim. It's basically a mock tip sheet for Western journalists who are writing about the African continent. And I'd like to just quote a few excerpts to start with, and we'll discuss what you were trying to achieve through this essay. Okay. So in the book, I'm just going to quote just a few sentences here. You say, when you write about Africa, always use the word Africa, darkness, or safari in your title. Never have a picture of a well-adjusted African unless that African has won the Nobel Prize. Remember, any work you submit in which people look filthy and miserable will be referred to as the real Africa. Do not feel queasy about this, you say. Remember, you're trying to help them get aid from the West. It's pretty brilliant, if you ask me. What do you see as the fundamental problem, Binyavanga Wainaina? Why do you think there is so much bad reporting on Africa?
You know, they used to tell us in school that when the missionaries came, they came smiling and hugging and bringing the Bible, and right behind them came the guns and the power. So in a certain sense, I feel like the world of humanitarianism and aid in Africa is designed to keep people passive, dependent, and allow power. So the arrival of this world of embedded aid, of the pity African, of the compassionate African, pity the baby, and all of that, came at the same time as the fall of the IMF, the fall of Russia, and the beginning of opening up the continent, where every government was told, cut down your budgets for university education, right? Which is what my generation happened. Let the middle class collapse and open yourselves to European and Western markets. Those two things come together. So that's just the happy face of the same PR machine.
But the starving orphan in Sudan or Somalia, the image that's in Western imaginations, that starving orphan does exist,
yes.
Doesn't he?
Oh, yes. The question
So
is not
you
so
shouldn't talk about him?
No. The question is not the question about talking about him. It's that since the 90s in particular, but throughout the relationship between Africa and the West, that is the dominant narrative. If you go back to the 19th or 18th century, it was the child, the willful child who needs to be contained or controlled, or who can be enslaved, right? Now it's the child who needs your breast. But the question becomes, you start getting a 17-year-old girl coming on her gap year, going to teach grown-ups in Kenya, near a safari location, of course, where you enjoy the gap year and add something to your CV, how to use a condom, right? Because somehow that 17-year-old girl just out of school will know how to tell a 50-something-year-old married woman that a condom is good for her. So, and then this gets financed by the EU and all these whatevers as something good that they are doing. Or if you look at the website in Kenya of any Western embassy, they talk about partnerships for development, and then you see a lot of school children suffering and then being helped by the ambassador. But they don't list the companies that are operating here. So it's the question of what's the full picture. If doing business with us is a good thing, why don't we see it? And I guess in a certain way, that's how our relationship in Africa in a time of growing with the East is starting to change, because you're having a more honest
So
conversation.
you're in favor, basically, of reforming the notion of aid.
Yes.
But I'd like to touch
Sure,
on
sure,
that
sure,
just
sure.
a little later. Just coming back
Yes.
to this essay, How to Write About Africa. So basically, what you're trying to say is that the media reinforces these stereotypes, but the apparent use of these stereotypes to cover Africa, are they peculiar just to the continent, or is it simply not just a feature of news coverage of all parts of the world? Is there something about African coverage that's worse than anywhere else?
A significant amount of coverage, probably the vast majority of coverage on Africa by the West, reinforces the pre-existing idea. The story has to start. Kenya is experiencing economic growth. After the devastation of the rest of the continent, the exception starts. So the existing narrative must be a dependent and collapsed place. And then, maybe there's a good news story, if you're lucky. No, quite sincerely, the coverage of it does not happen.
So how then do you write about Africa, a place that, occupies such a mythic place in our imagination, in Western imaginations? If you were, let's say, to be the news director of a major Western news outlet today, how would you cover Africa?
The point is, I'm not a head of a mythic news organization. What I am is an African intellectual.
So what would you tell? What would you tell them?
What I would tell them is that now, as the world is changing and there's a multipolar world, your depiction of Africa becomes more distorted, cartoonish. Our respect for you diminishes, and that's the reason that I came back and said there comes a time when you're like, we're not really talking to you anymore. There comes a time that you intellectuals in Africa have, the reason that essay went viral was because it meant something. In the United States, African immigrants are the highest educated social group in America, right? The middle class has always been strong and powerful. We've gone through ups and we've gone through downs. But the clear line around the mythic place that you refer to comes from a very specific thing. The scramble for Africa, the partition of Africa, and the embedded image the West decided to have, and then all the stories must fit that image. Whether or not that image is necessarily true, it's part of the bloodstream of the West.
What were you trying to achieve? Who was it for?
I'm born in Nakuru, in the highlands, in the middle of Safari country. From a child, you turn like this, Karen Blixen. You want to have coffee, you have to have a coffee in a Karen Blixen coffee house. Yeah. You receive the images as a child of this world where people from here, correspondents from here, are selling an idea of white mischief, safari country,
And it's
safari
interesting.
Kenya, and petty Kenya.
It's interesting that you talk about the correspondence, because in the 2012 edition of How to Write About Africa, you say Nairobi is a good place to be an international correspondent. There are regular flights to the nearest genocide, and there are green lawns, tennis courts.
Yes. So, again, coming back by the question. So here, Kenya is an interesting place positioned within Africa, but always been inside the traffic of the West. So from when I was a child, you're seeing this weird thing where you're like, you open, say, Safari Africa, and then look out the window, and you're like, at some point you start to believe that there's another Africa, not this one, that is real.
A parallel.
That's real. And you get to the point of adulthood, travel and start to see, and you start to understand the distortions, and you're like, why is it so sticky when you talk to somebody who's well-read and has 2 or 3 degrees somewhere in the West, that they're sticking to an extremely narrow 3 or 4 bullet points about what it is? Not just the giraffes, not just the perpetual poverty, so that you're perpetually, even as a professor in America, 7 years, explaining to your person, no, it's not that we are now going to study literature and then talk about the starving baby. I need to tell you that there are more things than a starving baby to begin to talk.
Right.
And
But that's changing, though, isn't it? Isn't it changing?
Not in the coverage of the news. Now that China is in and there's coal and there's oil, the coverage is changing, right? But the coverage is changing slightly sullenly. And the coverage is also changing, I think, because the relationship...
But what about African journalists? Why don't they tell the true story of Africa?
I think that the question, this essay and this program was very specifically talking about Western perceptions of Africa.
You touched on this just a short while ago. You're among a rising generation of African voices who bring a cautionary perspective to the morality and efficacy behind many Western initiatives to abolish poverty and speed development on the African continent. You say they should be a reform of the very notion of aid. What precisely do you see as the negative neo-colonial effects of aid? Because I think we can talk about neo-colonialism. What are some of the examples that you can give us concretely?
Okay, I came back here in 1995 to work. My father and a group of people bought a cotton ginnery at the days of privatization. I traveled 7 districts in Kenya. I was shocked. I went to a government extension officer, agricultural extension officer here in Kenya. And they told me, maybe because I shouldn't name the name, I'm happy to name the name, a certain international NGO,
Which
cannot, Plan International, yeah? Plan, they was like, no, you cannot, I can't leave my office until you pay me the per diem that Plan pays me to live here and service the farmers. That's a paid government official. I went to districts where the chief, the DO, the DC, and the community members were like, if you don't invite Plan to the meeting, we can't start to talk about cotton. That's neo-colonialism.
Okay.
That crude. And we're not talking about a country here that has fallen in the throes of war. Kenya is not a rich or poor country, but has very, very functional government structures that go
But
all
there
the way
is
up and
corruption.
down. Oh, yes. But the idea that you have people embedded in making policy, influencing decisions, right? Funding things. So then you start to hear a country that was feeding itself 15 years ago, there's a drought in Ukambani, they are calling the donors. Why? It makes the job easy. The MP doesn't have to do it. That level of dependency is a power game. It seems like anything else. It has all its happy sounds, but it is the application of massive amounts of passive power. And as I told you, those policies were implemented in the 90s here in Africa, which came at the same time where we were told, open your markets for us. You will not have any restrictions of your markets. You will not give farm subsidies to your people. So when that cotton business had collapsed in those areas, it had collapsed very directly because you couldn't give farm subsidies anymore, while Europeans could. That's neo-colonialism. I was brought up...
But isn't corruption a consequence, an effect of colonialism?
Like how?
It's my question. I'm asking you, don't you think?
I won't go... There's arguments that you could make that are valid on that, on the question, right? The rise of elites, who was lifted from the ground,
Right.
who partners the British and got huge rewards. That's rife all over the continent. Of course, we are now 50 years after colonialism, and we are dealing in a place where we are sovereign, self-determined, nations that self-determine their own fate. So to hark back to that also is looking for a kind of victimhood that's not helpful. I'm for take the person who's stolen from the till and arrest him. And what I'm trying to say is that you've had seasons where things go low and things go high.
Why has it been so difficult to tackle corruption in your country, in Kenya? All these leaders come and say, oh, we'll fight corruption, we'll do this and that, and nothing seems to happen.
One, many things have and do happen. Grand corruption in Kenya remains a crisis, but grand corruption that destroys the very fabric of your institutions, like we had in the 90s, is much diminished because you have much more functional institutions going on. I got my passport in 3 days without paying a cent. I was like, what? What just happened? Right? You get service from the state in a much more substantive and difficult sense. So what I like to make clear is 8 years ago, Kenya had ceased to be a country whose government served its job. Or served its public, and government services were not functional, and that has been substantially reformed. Now, grand corruption remains, grand capital moving around, sweeping inside here. Sometimes you hear it's cocaine money, sometimes you hear kidnapping money, sometimes you hear so-and-so is partnering with so-and-so. That remains. It is one, part of a global system, and it is two, part of the system of rot that comes from the rotten side of what we are as a neo-colonial country that never fully reformed. And the questions that you start to answer in those questions start to be the battle for a new constitution, how a new constitution starts to devolve responsibility, self-determination, that when you have, the governor, then the president, you see the neo-colonial state coming together, the centralized state, then now they are bartering and dishing out benefits across. When you have a county system, you have more accountability close to the ground where you have people. So what I'm trying to say is there are always perpetually moves to make that change, and there's always feedback, but that in general, we move forward.
How do you respond to the images of the powerful Hollywood elites, the Angelina Jolies and George Clooney's, who are out to save Africa?
You know, I had a friend, our friend is an intellectual, who told me, these days misery has a price. So let's say you get into a little sex scandal. So you quickly dash off to Malawi or to Zimbabwe, show your face, and your brand name starts to climb up. So, you know, that's just part of their business. It has really very little to do with me. My hope, of course, is that they'll be denied perpetually a visa to come to my country and disappear from the universe at all. But I'll tell you, these days, 5 years ago, I'd be getting pissed off. These days, I take it with a pinch of salt. The real question is, in the last 5 years, we've seen a multipolar world come. I'm interested in a powerful Africa. And I really mean an Africa with power in the globe. Power with capital P. Yeah? That's something that's important to me, and that's, I think, something that's important to us, where we have our say, and our say means something. And that I intend to work for. 2, it's just no longer the case anymore that you can actually willfully ignore them. And in the last 3-4 years, if you ignore them, you hear the president's calling, say, I'm busy. Why? I'm talking to China. The world's changed. And so what's happening is, if you see the media coverage...
Do you think China is out to replace the former powers as far as exerting influence on the African continent? Because you see there's a big Chinese presence in Kenya.
I think that the Chinese hunger for things poses all kinds of threats and opportunities for us and everybody.
It does.
But I'll also say, I'd rather do business with someone who's saying, I'm going to buy your thing for so much, than the person who tells me, I'm donating Red Cross, humanitarian, all that nonsense, while they are still messing you. Right now, in terms of economic influence, the West's influence and its bad terms of engagement and bad terms and contracts remain very strong on this continent. Then on the front, the PR game of small dribbles of money that pretend to be saving or helping Africa becomes what their media decides to cover, which doesn't give you the story of what the money is changing hands. So in a certain sense, the word, which has now become a Western word, transparency, and then the media says China is not transparent. In actual fact, the West's relationship to Africa is not transparent at all. Everybody's impression in the West is that they are just being good over there, and they're not.
They're not.
Yeah.
You wrote an interesting article in the New York Times about the post-election violence in Kenya. What went wrong, Binyavanga, in Kenya? I lived in this country in the 1990s, and Kenya was vibrant. Kenya was a country on the move. You know, the economy was doing well. Everyone was talking about multi-parties, democracy, and so on. What went wrong in 2007, 2008?
I'm going to put it like this. Kwame Nkrumah, I had a bet with Houphouet Boigny of Cote d'Ivoire, where you say, who says first? Seek ye first the political kingdom, or seek ye first the economic kingdom? Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire decided to go the route, as to say Kenyatta and Houphouet Boigny decided to go to the route of wait for these people to be ready to receive political liberation. So allow the multinationals, allow everybody else to come in, allow that growth to happen. It happened. But what happened is that our own political relationships with one another are extremely mature. And our political system kept people down to a point at which, when that happened, you want to call it ethnicities or anything else.
Are the ethnic tensions that we hear about often in Western media, is that over-exaggerated, do you think?
I think it has been exacerbated by how the political system works. Because it's very base, I'm sorry to say, and extremely, I'll call it even medieval. That's what I was trying to tell you. In 30 or 40 years, there was no thought about how to make useful political systems of the ground for people to relate to each other. And that's why you see what Cote d'Ivoire went, and that's why you see where Kenya went. And that's why Ghana didn't go there, because they had their coups and everything, but they did build a solid identity as a country, a solid political identity as a country, and are then versatile and muscular. Kenya's finally learning painfully the costs of that, and the rush you can see of the old fogies in government to pass the constitution, make sure that that constitution is what people have been fighting for 30, 20 or 30 years.
Is Kenya then back from the precipice? I mean, have they learned? Is the country going to heal? after what happened 5 years ago?
We have taken strong steps forward, but the battle continues as it does anywhere in the world. Those forces are always there. So you put a bit of doom, you spray them, and they come crawling out of the cupboards again to come eating up at you.
Right. I want to talk a bit more about you. You're a rising star, whether you like it or not. You were nominated by the World Economic Forum in 2007 as a Young Global Leader, an award which is given to people, they say, for their potential to contribute to shaping the future of the world. But you declined the award. Why do you reject this idea that you, Binyavanga Wainaina, a young Kenyan intellectual, could impact world affairs?
Like any good young middle-class African boy, I'm supposed to collect scholarships and awards and ticks on my whatever to climb up the ladder of success. I don't mind. I just felt that the way the World Economic Forum itself handled the situation was not serious. You have to be taken seriously. And I'm sorry to say, what happened was people started emailing me to say, you've been nominated for this thing. I hadn't been told. Then when I got the email, at first I thought it was those Nigerian scams, like 419s. It seemed very Prince such and such and Princess such and such. But they didn't tell me why. And that seemed to me to be a very cut-paste way where they Googled up a lot of people, put them on a list, and of course brown people will be like, I'm going to get a visa, a business class ticket to go. I'm sorry, I don't do that.
But surely, Binyavanga...
So I turned it down. I didn't even write to them first. I just sent it to a few people and I replied to the email, right? Because I just felt like, if you're serious about something, you call, right? And then you say, this is what we are up to, this is what we do, this is what we do. So I can take you seriously.
But surely you must fantasize about fame, fortune, and
yes, I
credibility.
do.
That would have been a good way to get there.
That's just cheap. Yeah, I want to work for what I get. That's why I go and write my book. Yeah, I want to work for what I get and get it because it's been earned. Just because.
How do you feel about being called the African writer, the new African writer, being likened to Chinua Achebe or Ngugi wa Thiong'o? How do you feel about that?
Oh, I'll sleep nicely in the morning, and then in the morning I'll go and read Igoni Barrett's book and think, I think he's the one. I think he's the one. It's not me. I think it's Teju Cole. I think it's Dorit Baigana. I think it's, I work in publishing. I've worked and published so many young African writers and all of that. I have always seen it like, I felt that if people who show talent networked strongly with each other and helped each other get agents, get into the system, self-publish, build local publishing houses, right? That's the way for us to push ourselves forward.
Right. And you founded the literary magazine Kwani. I want to talk about that.
Yes.
What do you see as the challenge today for African writers? Many of the well-known African writers that you and I know, whether it's Ngozi Adichie, Chimamanda, or Ben Okri, have left the African shores.
The challenge is, there's some people who've been critical and rightly critical to say, African writers are always writing about the problems of society. And I think that there's something to that. At a time now when we've started to register real growth, real change, real political change, real social change, that, so many things are happening, right? For our generation, the next 10 and 15 years are going to be also involving in how do you start to reimagine how it could be? How you start to imagine how beautiful it could be, how wonderful it could be. Not to avoid the reality, but to start, artists have always also built these homes that people reside in and imagine, wow, this is what my nation, my continent, my community can look like. So I think that now becomes the challenge. The era of the writer, the artist, as the political activist will always be there. But the season where we were on extremely hard pressure to provide change doesn't mean that then that is all our job. So I think the opening it up to now be part of the people who are envisioning, who are creating, who are using their imagination and all the arts, I think that that's a very, very key place. People need to have an imaginary home to live in and to imagine as much as they need to eat.
It's fascinating. Thank you so much. It's been such an interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Binyavanga Wainaina, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.